Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Introduction to Philosophy. This week begins our 2-week endeavor into the philosophy of mind. Let's jump in. So, the philosophy of mind is a subfield within metaphysics, where metaphysics, again, is just the study of reality. What kinds of things are there? How do they relate to one another? What properties do they have, etc.? So, in the philosophy of mind, we ask questions like what are thoughts or beliefs? What is the imagination? What is the nature of consciousness? And most generally, what is the mind? So, the mind body problem is perhaps the greatest problem within the philosophy of mind. It has to do with how the mind and the body are supposed to be related. Are they the same thing, or are they in some way separate? If they are separate things, then how is it that they interact with one another? These are both aspects of the mind body problem. So, this week, we're going to look into dualist views on the mind body problem. Okay, so dualism then. Dualism is a metaphysical position that works exactly as it sounds, right? Dual meaning two, right? So it holds that there's two sorts of things. There's the material, that's just a synonym for physical, and the immaterial, right? So there's the physical and the non-physical. So in the philosophy of mind, then, dualism is just the view that, well, there's the mind and there's the body. The body is a physical thing, the mind is not. So the mind is immaterial or non physical. There are two different kinds of substance, mind and body. But there's differences amongst dualists as well, right? Dualism is a uh, umbrella category, right? So in order to explore the differences here, let's start with substance dualism. Substance dualism just is that commitment to the idea that there's two kinds of substance, material and mental, right? Body, mind. Further, when we talk about substance dualism in the philosophy of mind, we think of mind as being immaterial, right? Not at all physical. There is no physical component to the mind whatsoever. These two things are all the way apart, right? You've got a body and you've got a mind, and the two don't touch in that respect. Okay, so generally when you hear dualism within the context of philosophy of mind, we're talking about this. We're talking about substance dualism. But there are alternatives that we'll get to soon. So while substance dualists agree that the mind and the body are two totally different things, they're two totally different kinds of substance, they disagree in terms of how the two are supposed to relate to one another. We have three positions on this: occasionalism, parallelism, and interactionism. So it seems like the story goes the mind influences the body, and perhaps vice versa. Right? So when I form the intention, for example, of raising my hand, it seems like my mind is capable of making my body do that. Right? So the mental, my mind, seems capable of making some kind of physical effect happen. Right? Similarly, if I were to stub my toe, for example, it seems like something in the body, stubbing my toe, could cause something mental, the pain that I experience as a result. Well, how do we explain that kind of interaction when the two things are different? We need some kind of story that's going to do the explaining here. Well, occasionalism is the view that that's just wrong, right? It's not the case that your mind can influence your body, and it's not the case that your body can send information to your mind. That doesn't happen. Instead, they argue, God is the only thing capable of causing effects. And therefore, when your mind forms the idea of, say, raising your hand, it's not your mind that causes anything. God simply takes your intention and makes it happen in your body, right? So God is actually the cause of all of these things. Okay, seems a bit far-fetched, but we'll soon see why this is a view. Parallelism is somewhat similar in that it argues that the mind and the body don't actually interact in the way you might think that they do. Instead, the parallelist argues that there are two parallel tracks, right? There's two parallel lives that you have, one mental and one physical, and they seem to overlap, right? So when I stub my toe in the physical track, yeah, I experience pain on the mental track at the same time. But that's not because the body causes these feelings in the mind. They just happen to be running parallel. Most parallelists will argue that once again, God is the reason why these two things are set this way, right? So it's not merely by coincidence. Okay, by far, most substance dualists are interactionists, right? Interactionism is this view that captures what we think is intuitive, right? That the mind really does have some kind of effect on the body, and perhaps vice versa. Okay, so why isn't everyone just an interactionist then? Why do we have occasionalism and parallelism? Well, here we're going to look into Princess Elizabeth's objection. So, the most famous interactionist substance dualist is Descartes. Princess Elizabeth is one of his students, okay? So she offers this challenge to Descartes' view that we still today regard to be the most important challenge against the substance dualist. It goes like this: if the mind and the body are supposed to be different substances, then how can one possibly affect the other? A non physical thing doesn't have physical parts that allow it to touch a physical thing, to cause anything to happen in a physical thing. And a physical thing doesn't have any mental parts that allow it to touch the mind. So, how can the two engage in any kind of interaction, right? By arguing, in other words, that there are two completely distinct substances, the dualist seems to not have any tools whatsoever to provide for this kind of interaction. And it doesn't seem like there's going to be any way to answer this objection. Now, you could try to get out of this by being an occasionalist or a parallelist, like we saw earlier, but those views, of course, have their own problems. Most people who are substance dualists prefer to remain in this problem and leave it unsolved than to resort to parallelism or occasionalism. But there are still other ways out. One way out is to instead adopt what we might call property dualism. So, property dualism holds that there are not two distinct substances. There's not the mental and the physical, and these two things are entirely different kinds of being. Instead, there's only one kind of substance, physical stuff. There's just the physical, but it has different properties. There are mental properties and there are physical properties. So, two different kinds of properties, but the same stuff. So, things like beliefs, thoughts, and desires, these are all mental properties of physical things. Well, what does that mean? It means that these sorts of properties come about from and thus depend on the physical substance beneath them, like the brain, but that we cannot simply understand these kind of properties the same way we understand normal physical things. These mental properties cannot be explained in the same way. Okay. First up, this is a form of property dualism. It's called emergentism. Emergentism is the view that minds or mental states, mental properties, in some way emerge from complex physical processes, but they are not identical with them. So, in other words, when matter is arranged in a particular way, like a brain, for example, mental phenomena can emerge from them, right? But these mental phenomena cannot be explained in the same way that we might explain the brain. They have emerged from the brain, right? Thus, we cannot reduce them to the brain. Okay, so they have emerged from the physical. In some respect, these mental properties are at base physical, but we cannot understand them with a purely physicalist explanation, right? We have to understand them as something more, something over and above. Then we have epiphenomenalism. It's very similar to emergentism in that it also holds that mental aspects of experience or consciousness, whatever you want to call it, emerge from a physical thing and yet are somehow still distinct from that physical thing. The difference is that the epiphenomenalist thinks that these mental states are causally inefficacious. That means that they're incapable of causing things, right? So once you have a brain and out of that emerge these phenomenal phenomena, right? These conscious phenomena, these mental phenomena, it's not the case that these things which have emerged can go back and affect the physical, right? For the emergentist, that is possible, but not so for the epiphenomenalist. They've adopted this kind of causally inefficaciousness because they're concerned with falling back into that problem that the interactionist had, right? They don't want to be back in a situation where they're going to say something like, this purely mental thing can have some kind of effect on a physical thing, right? So in wanting to avoid that, they go for something like causal inefficaciousness. Lastly, a more nuanced view, panpsychism. Okay, so panpsychists also hold that there's really just one kind of substance, but that kind of substance is both physical and mental all in one. In other words, everything, every fundamental particle has some degree of mentality to it. So where they differ from the emergentist and the epiphenomenalist is that the emergentist and the epiphenomenalist thought that mental things only came into existence as emergent phenomena that only arise when there's a certain kind of complex arrangement of physical things. The panpsychist is saying, no, from the very fundamental level, there is mentality. Mentality is all throughout existence. So the things that we generally consider to be mindless or completely inert, for the panpsychist, they do have some degree of mentality. Your chair, your pen, the sun, there is mentality to all of these things. That doesn't mean, of course, that those things are conscious in the same way that we are. Just in the same way that you can have more complex physical arrangements of atoms, right? There's a difference in terms of physical composition between a rock and my brain. You can have differences here too, right? Maybe it's the case that when you get a certain amount of complexity, you get enough of this mentality together, you get something like a conscious mind that we're familiar with. Still, nevertheless, panpsychists are going to argue that even at the fundamental level, there's mentality to everything. Okay. So we've seen a few different dualist positions now, but we haven't yet asked, why should we be a dualist, right? What motivates this idea of dualism? We'll look at a few different reasons. The first is that it might appeal to common intuitions, right? So to make this case, philosophers generally point to a few different kinds of thought experiments. The one that I want to use here, it has to do with the autocerebroscope, right? So the autocerebroscope allows you to, in real time, view the neurological goings on of your brain, right? So you can watch your neurons firing, see where all the neurotransmitters are being distributed in real time. Well, when doing so, when looking through the autocerebroscope, it doesn't seem like you're able to see your thoughts. It doesn't seem like you're able to see your beliefs, your emotions, your qualitative experience, right? It doesn't seem like you're able to see what it's like to see the things you're seeing, right? If that's the case, then it seems like the mind and the body must be distinct. Why? Well, because the brain is, at least for these purposes of conversation, the bodily aspect, right? You're seeing it through the autocerebroscope. But if in seeing it, you are not seeing the things we regard to be your mental life, then it seems like the two aren't the same, right? It seems like the two aren't the same. Further, it might appeal to you for certain religious reasons, right? If you're already committed to a kind of metaphysical view like a soul, it's not a far off notion that you have something like a mind that is completely independent of your body, right? You've already bought into your identity somehow being located in something that's not physical. Well, it's not very far off from saying that the mind itself is not physical. In fact, a lot of substance dualists just think that the soul and the mind are the same thing. Okay, more nuanced philosophical reasons for preferring dualism. Most dualists today argue that we should be dualist because it's the only solution to what they call the hard problem of consciousness. So, the hard problem of consciousness deals with our experiences and the qualities of those experiences. The idea here is that there doesn't seem to be a way to give a physical explanation of our qualitative experiences. Well, what is a qualitative experience? Well, imagine you're looking at a red apple, right? You're experiencing some kind of redness. There's a quality to your experience of redness. When you're listening to my voice now, there's something that it's like for you to hear my voice. These kinds of features of your experience we call qualia. So the hard problem then is just about how we're supposed to handle qualia. If you're a dualist, handling qualia is pretty easy, right? Those are just things that belong to the mind. It's not a surprise that when we look in the autocerebroscope, we can't find them. But if you're a physicalist, that's not open to you. You need to be able to explain how we can find those qualia just by looking at something like the brain. The dualist wants to say that simply isn't going to be possible. So, for the remainder of this lecture, we're going to look at two kinds of thought experiments, two kinds of problems that dualists use to make this point. Okay, so let's begin. The first is Mary the Color Scientist. We get this from Frank Jackson. So, here's how it goes. Imagine a color scientist, Mary. She's been locked away all her life in a completely colorless room. She's only ever seen shades of gray. She's extremely brilliant and has learned all that there is to learn about color, all of the physical facts about color and color perception, right? She knows exactly which wavelengths provoke an experience of red under which conditions, everything there is to know about color, and everything there is to know about color perception. In effect, then, she knows everything there is to know about the physical process of seeing red. She knows, in other words, all of the physical facts about seeing the color red. Okay. Let's suppose one day, then, that Mary gets out of her colorless room. As soon as she leaves the room, she encounters a red apple for the first time. Jackson's question is, does Mary learn anything new? In looking at the apple, does she learn anything new? Well, if you say yes, Mary does learn something new in experiencing the red of the apple for the first time. You're saying that the physical facts are not all of the facts. Remember, Mary is supposed to know absolutely everything there is to know about color and color perception. So if she learned something new, then her knowledge of the physical was not exhaustive of what it is to see red, right? Okay, what's the answer then? Well, it seems like there is some non-physical component of what it's like to see red, that qualitative experience. Okay, next we get philosophical zombies. Right? The idea of P-zombies, philosophical zombies, comes from David Chalmers. So David Chalmers asks us to imagine a perfect copy of you. It has a body that's completely identical to yours. It talks the same way that you do. It behaves the exact same way that you do. In fact, its brain works the same way as yours. Because of these reasons, no one could ever tell the difference between you and your P-zombie. The only difference is that the P-zombie doesn't have that kind of qualitative experience. They don't have that what it's likeness, right? That the redness when they see an apple. So Chalmers wants to question us. Do you think that's conceivable? Do you think it's possible for a P-zombie to exist that has a brain that works exactly the same way as yours does, but nevertheless does not have this qualitative experience? Now, conceivable doesn't necessarily mean possible. It just means that you can think of it without there being a contradiction, right? If you say that, yes, this can be conceivable, a pea zombie could theoretically exist, Chalmers thinks he's got you, right? Why? Well, because if everything is physical, then it having the same exact kind of brain as yours should have been enough to say that it has the exact same kind of mental life as yours. It should have been enough. But if you are in addition saying, well, look, I have this kind of qualitative experience, but I can imagine this pea zombie who has the exact same kind of brain as me not having it, then what you are in effect saying is that this kind of qualitative experience cannot be captured by a purely physical account of consciousness. So once again, it seems like there is something non-physical about certain kinds of qualitative experiences. Okay, so looking forward into next week, we're going to look at responses from physicalists, right? Physicalism is the view that no, the mind just is physical. In fact, most physicalists, the ones we're going to hear from at least, are going to argue that the mind just is the brain. They're going to need then some way of getting around this hard problem, right? They're going to need to deny the significance of the hard problem in order to answer the mind body problem in saying that, look, the mind just is the body. There is no separation whatsoever. So we'll hear from the physicalist next time. But until then, stay healthy and stay safe.